Hello, I'm Elizabeth Kelly, Managing Director for the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. This is part 2 of the workshop that we held at the Royal Society of Medicine in London. It's entitled Radio Frequency Radiation from Wireless Communication Sources. Are the safety limits valid? The opinions expressed by the speakers do not necessarily represent the positions taken by the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. Dr. Ken Chamberlin has a PhD from Ohio University in electrical engineering, specializing in computational electromagnetics. He is the past chair and professor emeritus in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire in the USA. Over his 35 years in academia, Dr. Chamberlin has performed research for more than 25 sponsors, including the National Science Foundation, and he has received 2 Fulbright Awards. He has served as an associate editor for the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. Dr. Chamberlin served on the New Hampshire State 5G Review Commission that was established through state legislation in 2019 to evaluate how the state should respond to potential health and environmental impacts associated with the rollout of the 5th generation wireless communications infrastructure. Dr. Chamberlin will be speaking on the work of the New Hampshire 5G Review Commission and separately about recent publications by the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. He currently serves as vice chairperson for ICBE-EMF.
We're now moving to the second speaker of the workshop, who has come all the way from New Hampshire in America. So welcome, Kent, and take it away.
All right. Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you. I spent all of my career studying electromagnetic waves. Early in my career, I climbed my masts to work on and take measurements on active antennas. I've designed antennas. I've computer modeled antennas and propagation. I even designed an antenna to be implanted under the skin to provide communications for implanted devices. My point here is that I clearly didn't think that there was a problem with wireless radiation. Well, I did know enough to tell people that no, you shouldn't hold your phone up to your head directly for too long a periods of time, but I thought that was a relatively low risk. What I thought was very typical and it was the conventional wisdom of people working in my field. And then things changed about 4 years ago when I was asked to serve on a state commission. And that's the commission I'll be talking with you about today. So I'm going to be talking about the commission, what our findings were, and I think you know the findings. I mean, it's pretty well known that what we found was that wireless radiation is indeed harmful. And it's very similar to what you heard from Dr. Mallory Blythe, that yes, it's harmful. And that is the bad news. But there is good news to go along with that. And that is, if we simply acknowledge that there is harm, there's a lot we can do about it. A lot that we can do about it. We as engineers, when we were told to design these devices, we weren't told to lower radiation. We were told to provide the fastest speed possible, and we did. So that's where I'm coming from on this, is that I'm an engineer. I had believed that there wasn't a problem with radiation. I got involved with this commission, and I found out something quite different. So I want to take you through that journey of discovery for me and the commission itself, because we didn't come in with preconceived ideas. I am, as you can probably tell, very much pro-technology. But the issue is, I don't want to come up with design technology that's going to harm people. And that is what we found. The current technology, as designed, is harmful. So let me take you, I have a conflict of interest statement here, and basically I'm saying, I'm not getting paid to be here. I have no motivation to tell you something. And this is important because what we found and what I've seen repeatedly is that you'll hear the people from the telecommunications industry say that there is absolutely no harm from wireless radiation. Of course, that's not what we found. So people who are paid to deliver a message will tell you that. And that's been my experience in the 4 years I've been involved, that the only people who make that statement are those who are affiliated with the telecom industry. So I'm telling you, I'm here, I'm doing it free, out of commitment. I just feel that people need to know what we found out as a commission, because you're unlikely to hear it from other places. So let's talk about the commission itself. First of all, why did the commission get formed in the first place? What was the motivation for forming a commission? As you'll see, it is no small task to form a commission. And the answer is that legislators, and by the way, a comment about legislators, in our state and in most states in our country, legislators are bombarded with legislation. As an example, in the state of Maine, one that I happen to know about directly, the legislators are asked to act on over 2,000 bills in one session. So if you have to act on 2,000 of anything, you're not going to have time to delve down and figure out what the truth is. So in this case, in the state of New Hampshire, legislators were being told by industry, again, what I said earlier, wireless radiation is perfectly harmless, and your state is going to go into the Stone Ages if you don't adopt and let us roll out new facilities. You're going to be left behind. So legislators were being told that by industry, and they were being told by their constituents that, no, we're being harmed, and we have the science to prove it. So the legislators didn't know what to do, being told two different things, so they decided to form a commission. And so in our state, to form a commission, and by the way, I didn't know that, didn't know what it took to form a commission, you need to go through legislation. It has to pass both houses of our legislature. It has to be bipartisan in nature, otherwise it won't pass through our legislatures. So yeah, it was a bill, it was like a 5-page bill, and it was passed, and it was signed by our conservative governor. So this wasn't just something that somebody thought would be a good idea, and let's just talk about this, or explore wireless radiation. Let's be really serious about it. Now, the legislation was very specific, and it called for the formation of a commission to explore the effects of wireless radiation. 5G was mentioned predominantly because it was new, and a lot of people are concerned about 5G, and I'll say rightfully so. So this is the first legislation in the United States, and perhaps the world, though perhaps the Dutch have something like that similar. It is the first legislation of its kind in the United States, but it's not the last. There are now currently 3 states that are also exploring having their own commission, and they're patterning it off of the New Hampshire Commission. So the idea of the commission was to answer, and built into the legislation were questions that actually got the legislation passed in the first place. And some of those questions were like the following. This isn't all of them. This is just an abbreviated list of questions. Why does the insurance company recognize wireless radiation as a risk, but won't insure against harms caused by it? I mean, that really got the legislators' attention. Because why would you possibly have something that even Lloyd's of London won't insure? Why have the many hundreds of peer-reviewed articles that show harm from wireless radiation, why are they ignored in setting the ICBE-EMF guidelines? And why are the guidelines? Why are our current exposure limits, why are they based only on thermal effects when we know that there are other long-term effects that aren't caused thermally? And finally, the fourth that I'm listing here, as I say, there are other ones in the legislation itself. Why did and Dr. Mallory Blythe talked about this, why does the WHO classify exposure to wireless radiation as a possible carcinogen, and FCC and ICNIRP don't even acknowledge that. They don't even mention that in their, when they set their standards. So the commission specified membership, so it not only posed questions to the commission to answer, but it also specified the membership. And I'm not going to go into detail here. This is just kind of a list that's within the legislation if you want to read the details. But I did want to point out that we also had on our commission people representing industry. We had one of the VPs of the, it was the Telecommunications Act Commission, or Telecommunications membership people. We had a member from somebody from the Business and Industries Association, somebody from, like as I mentioned, the wireless industry. So the reason I'm highlighting them in red is that in the final analysis, we came out with a report where the scientists on the commission came up with a set of conclusions, but the people from industry said, no, that's not right. Wireless radiation is harmless, and these guys were just biased to begin with. But you can read the report. I have a link in here later, and I'll talk a little bit about that report. The bottom line is we ended up with people having the expertise to answer the questions that were being asked of them. In particular, we had 2 medical doctors. They happened to be legislators also. People with physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, epidemiology, biostatistics, occupational health. So we had the gamut of disciplines that you need to answer the question like what we were being asked. So actually, let me pose a question to you. Let's say that you were being asked to serve on a commission. I mean, you had an area of expertise yourself, but you were trying to address a much more complex issue that involved your discipline, but not involved so much more. So what do? What's the first thing? You go to the peer-reviewed literature? And that's what we did. In fact, as soon as I got appointed to the commission, I started reading. And I was really surprised by what I found. There's a lot of information out there, and it shows the conclusions, or provides the conclusions that I'm about to tell you about, what our conclusions were. And also, I'm going to say a few more words about peer-reviewed publications, because I want to acknowledge that not all peer-reviewed publications, this is kind of a naive statement, not all peer-reviewed publications are reliable. So I'll talk a little bit about how we perform that vetting process. We also got information from regulatory agencies, the Federal Communications Commission, the people who are supposed to protect us against things that could be harmful, FDA, Federal Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency. So we invited them to come meet with us. And here's something that's kind of surprising. They were invited. Now, again, we're a state commission. We were voted in by the legislature. You'd think we would have some clout, but that turned out not to be the case, because they didn't come to meet with us, and they really didn't answer our questions. So we had emails going back and forth. They sent us links to various websites that didn't answer our question. So at this point, you may say, hey, why do you list the regulatory agencies there, the second bullet? Why do you list them as sources of information if they never showed up? And well, the answer is the fact that they didn't show up provided us with information. That's meaningful. Other sources of information were outside experts. So we did a search and we found people who are recognized experts in fields relating to exposure to wireless radiation and health. So all of those presenters that we brought in, all 9 of those presenters said, yes, there is harm from wireless radiation. But the one presenter who said, nah, there's no problem whatsoever with exposure, was the presenter who was brought in by the telecommunications industry. In fact, when the guy left, or as the guy was leaving his presentation, he said, I would stick my head in a microwave oven, there's no problem. So we should have taken him up on that offer. So the vetting of peer-reviewed material, we could spend an entire day on this. How do you know that something in peer-reviewed literature is worthwhile? How has it been properly vetted by the publication that put it out? And so one objective for me, because I've been in this industry for a long time, I've been involved with electromagnetic radiation, and I had believed, as I told you in the beginning, that it wasn't really all that harmful. And so, and one reason I thought that is because I believed what we were told by industry, and that is the statement that's up there right now. The telecommunications people, and I've heard this repeatedly, they repeat it to this very day, and they're saying that the only publications that show harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from what they call fringe journals. So one of my objectives, again, the first thing I did is I went and I started doing a search. I was finding lots and lots of papers that were saying that there was harm. And so were those fringe journals? I wanted to answer that question. Now, this isn't something that's new to me, the vetting of publications. As a department chair, I had to do that for my faculty members to evaluate the quality of publications done by my faculty. Sometimes they were a little bit out of my area of expertise. I was also an associate editor for IEEE, the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and also promotion and tenure committees. I was chair of a college P&T committee where I was evaluating the publications from people in chemistry, physics, and areas way outside of my area of expertise. So I did feel competent in evaluating publications to identify fringe journals. And I even engaged the help of our college librarian. We were very fortunate that our college, Engineering and Physical Sciences, has its own librarian, PhD in library sciences. And I posed to her the question, could we create a journal that would publish misinformation about wireless and get away with it? What would it take to do that? Well, I mean, we could do it, but it would take an amazing amount of money to do so. But in the final analysis, after looking through the journal articles that we used to draw our conclusions in the commission, the bottom line is that none of them were, or not none of them, we identified fringe journals, but we didn't use them in the New Hampshire Commission to draw our conclusions. So the outcome of that peer-reviewed literature search, we identified hundreds of top-tier publications that showed harm from low-level. When I say low-level wireless radiation, that's kind of like what you get from your cell phone. This is in airplane mode, by the way. And so hundreds of top-tier publications do show harm. And as of 2020, and so that answers the question about the quality, the fringe journals. No, there are lots of publications, non-fringe publications, that show harm. And are those cherry-picked? Did you have to search and cherry-pick only the ones that show harm? Well, the answer is no, and here's one case, and Dr. Mallory Blythe gave a more updated or a different version of this same type of analysis, and that is over 90% of studies showed free radical or oxidative damage resulting from low-level radio frequency radiation exposure. So 90%, that's hardly cherry-picking, I think you'll agree. So to answer the objective that I had on the previous slide, are the articles showing harm cherry-picked from fringe journals? No, that's not the case. And anybody tells you otherwise is either terribly misinformed or just not being truthful with you. Now, just to say a word, Dr. Mallory Blythe said more about oxidative stress, so I don't need to go into too much detail about it, but it is a precursor, can be a precursor to cancer. Now, so this oxidative stress relates to free radicals. So what are some of the things that can happen from excessive free radicals? For every one of these diseases that's shown, there are many, many publications. I just happen to make links, provide links to them. And you can see it, reproductive problems. If you can take a sperm in two separate, divide it into two separate test tubes and expose one to wireless radiation, put it near a cell phone, put the other one away from a cell phone, you'll see differences in motility and just the health of the sperm. I'm using that as an example. This is something that the commission wanted to know about. Okay, from what they saw, from what we knew at that point in the commission, which lasted a little over a year, we knew that there were problems associated with wireless radiation exposure. So a question that would arise, or that arose in the commission is, well, we supposedly have safety standards. Shouldn't we look to the safety standards to find out what that relationship, how they came up with them, and determine whether or not they really are problematic? Are they excessively high? And so what I'm doing, I'm dedicating 3 slides to this particular issue, how the current standards were set, the current exposure guidelines. So I just want to, I'm just warning you ahead of time, I'm going to spend 3 slides on this something just to make sure that you really understand it, because it doesn't make sense to me, and after showing this many, many times, I'm still surprised by it. So here's what happens. You have rats and monkeys, and you're seeing rats right here, but the limits were set in the 1980s and were based on studies of 8 rats and 5 monkeys, an N of 13. And they involved studies lasting less than an hour. And so what they did, and this is described in our paper, and it's linked right here. So the assumption is it's only heat, the only effect, the only thing that's going to cause a problem is heating by itself. If it's not strong enough to warm tissues, it's not a problem. And so the study itself involved food depriving the animals. The animals had been trained to push a lever to get food, and they were food deprived at the beginning of the study. So they put them in a cage, and of course they're pushing the lever, getting food, and then they're starting to crank up the exposure. They're cranking up the wireless radiation type exposure until they finally can no longer push the lever to get food, although they're still hungry. So when they got to that point, the level of exposure that they were receiving was designated as the threshold dose for adverse effects of RF radiation. And again, this is less than an hour. And so this exposure level was also associated with a 1 degree Celsius increase in core temperature for the animals. That was a totally arbitrary number that somebody picked up. So that's how the standards were set. But then they said, okay, now we know the maximum that an animal can tolerate. We've got to put in a safety factor. And so when you think about a safety factor, what do you think about? I mean, the idea of a safety factor is you take a known problem, such as the fact that they can no longer push a lever for food. In this case, the only endpoint was not being able to push the lever. And so they said, well, let's put in a safety factor. And what I mean by arbitrary is usually when you find a safety factor, that gives you a certain expectation for what will happen if you apply that safety factor. In other words, it's a confidence interval. You know, what will happen if I apply the safety factor? How many people are going to be harmed? There was none of that done to the best of my knowledge. So they just decided, well, let's use 50 for the population in general, so divide that upper exposure limit, and then use a factor of 10 for workers, and call it that. And that's what they did, and that's what's in place today. And also, I should mention, I won't go into much detail about this, the exposure is for the whole body. So if you only are being exposed by one part of your body, you average that exposure over the whole body, but in this case, it's only being applied to a smaller part of the body, which means that you can have 10 to 20 times, 25 times the exposure than if at this particular point, at your head, for example, than if it were being exposed to your whole body, and it still satisfies the standards. So just this recap, here's the third slide I promised you, and that is a recap of how those standards were set. And by the way, these standards are for lifetime exposure. You don't get away from it. It's not like you're going to go in and be exposed for an hour, but you are being exposed 24/7 using these standards. So these standards were set based upon studies lasting an hour or less, a single endpoint attributed only to heating, small sampling of animals. You can see how I was pretty amazed when I did this, saw this for the first time. And they used an arbitrary safety factor. It's not justified by science, it's just a safety factor, and they call it a safety factor. And if you listen to people from the telecommunications industry, they make a big deal of this. Oh yeah, we have applied a safety factor of 50. It's meaningless. So one reason that the short-term nature of these studies are meaningless is for the following. And this is an example using trees, but it really brings home the effect that wireless radiation can have. So in this study, and I have the reference for it on the next slide, it started off in 2008. And you have an antenna, which is on the left there, and it's 142 meters away from a tree. And the tree looks pretty healthy in 2008, but if you now fast forward for 7 years, you're going to see that part of the tree is degraded. And you might, if you just saw that, you might not think of the connection between the fact that it's being exposed and the fact that it's being degraded. And then the next picture, going on 4 years later, is a lot more degradation to the tree. And what happened in this particular case is they had to cut the tree down And this case or the study that I'm referring to involves 30 trees. They looked at quite a few trees in a city, and what they found is that those that are exposed to radiation, over time, are degraded and oftentimes have to be cut down. Now, something I'd like to point out here, if you look down by the circle, it's probably kind of hard to read, that the left side of the tree, side of the tree getting the greatest exposure, had a radiation exposure of 0.03% of ICNIRP FCC the guidelines. That's almost nothing. And so it's that long-term exposure that causes the problem. It's kind of like smoking causes the problem over the long term. I mean, using the type of tests that they performed to determine the guidelines, you could, using the same type of thinking, you could have a group of people smoke a cigarette, a pack of cigarettes each in a period of an hour, and if they all lived, you'd say, hey, smoking's safe. It's kind of equivalent to that. But you might want to know, and that's good for trees, and by the way, that did have an impact on us as a commission when we saw that radiation, even low-level radiation, can kill trees. And so if it can kill trees, what's it do to a child? So, but let's get in and talk about, this is something, I just wanted to throw this in so you'd have references, and very similar to what Dr. Mallory Blythe did, references to how other flora and fauna are affected. There are lots and lots of studies out there. But let's look at what happens to people. And I'm using this particular example. There are lots of studies that look at similar things, and they come up with similar conclusions. But let's look at what happens and what the relationship is between the death rates from cancer and how far somebody lives from a cell tower. And so this study was performed, and you can click on the link again. It was performed in Brazil between 1996 and 2006. So it explored the relationship, and it's a pretty straightforward study. Where does the person live? I mean, you can get that from database, and and you get also there's a database for people who die of cancer, and so you correlate the two. Where did this person that died from cancer, were they close to a tower? Were they far from a tower? That information is available. And this looked, and I used, it said that the standards for exposure were set with an N of 13. Well, in this case, this study that we're looking at right here involved thousands of people. In particular, they looked at over 7,000 cancer deaths for people living around over 800 towers, so a very large N right here. It gives you a lot more confidence in the results than if you had a much smaller N. So one reason I feel like this study is particularly important is because it happened in that period between 1996 and 2006 when most people in Brazil did not have their own cell phones. And the reason that's important is that we're looking at the effect of cell towers and not their people's own electronic devices. So the results of the study are shown easily in a single slide, and here it is. So what you're seeing here is the mortality rate for cancers, from cancers, on the y-axis. On the x-axis is the distance that people live from a cell tower. And the blue line represents the cancer rate, the cancer death rate for the population in general, and the red trace represent those living closer to a cell tower and their death rate by cancer. And one thing that is, the first things you check out, one is, does the red trace asymptote to the blue trace over time, as it should? As you get farther and farther from a cell tower, your cancer rate, your death rate by cancer, should be the same as for the population in general. And also, you see a monotonic dose response rate. The closer you are to the tower, the greater exposure you're going to have, and the greater the death rate. So these are very believable results. So so you can see the relationship. Is there a problem with living close to a cell tower? I would say the answer is yes, and that's one reason that we, as the commission, the New Hampshire Commission, recommend a setback for new facilities. We haven't gotten very far with legislation on that, but that was our recommendations. Put towers away from where people live. And so the next question is, how far should that tower be? Now, you're looking at the same plot that I'm looking at, and the same plot that the New Hampshire Commission looked at. What's the safe distance? And I'm using that word safe very cautiously. maybe we should rephrase that. What is a reasonable distance? Where would you want to live in terms of distance from a cell tower? Well, you're not going to satisfy everybody, and there's no such thing as safe when it comes to something that can harm you, like wireless exposure. And so I would like to live greater than 1 kilometer away, but the number we came up with is 500 meters, saying that it's a reasonable value. You're going to get exposed. If somebody has EHS, particularly severe EHS, they can't live there. That wouldn't work for them. You know, they'd have to live farther away from a cell tower. So we picked 500 meters. Yeah, you'd still have elevated risk, but it seems to be reasonable. So was that a one-off study? You know, they're the only ones to make that discovery. The answer is no. There was a meta-study performed that looked at all studies before that, or 38 studies in particular, that evaluated the risk of living near a cell tower, the harms of living near a cell tower, and how far away you had to be. And 3/4 of the studies, as you can see here, had the effects of radio frequency sickness. This was talked about earlier. About 3/4 of them showed cancer, increased cancer. You have changes in biochemical parameters for the body. So, and then the bottom one here is a distance of 500 meters was mentioned in a good number of those studies as being a reasonable distance to live from a cell tower. So that's what we came up with. And the commission was kind of flummoxed at that point. How can these guidelines be so wrong? How come the FCC is not protecting us? And we found this right here. And I'm actually curious if you'd give me a little show of hands. How many people are familiar with this concept of captured agency? It's okay, about half of you. I mean, you even look at the title here. Oh, by the way, this is not some conspiracy theory. This is from the Harvard University Center for Ethics. And the title is very indicative of what's going on. Captured agency, how the Federal Communication Commission is dominated by the industry it presumably regulates. That's what's going on. And that's why we, as a commission, kind of shrugged our shoulders. What can we do here? But we did come out with our report, and we had conclusions. The final report, how's timing going?
5 minutes, sir.
I got 5 minutes. I've got to go quickly. So we issued our final report in November 2020, and some of our conclusions were wireless radiation. No surprise here. Wireless radiation, which includes 5G, poses a significant threat to human health and the environment. Electrohypersensitivity, Dr. Mallory Blythe talked about this, is an illness caused by wireless radiation. We had heard from the telecom industry that it was all in people's heads that you'd have EHS. It's not real. That's what they told us. This is not solely a scientific issue. The science is pretty clear. There's a problem. It's what I call a political economic issue. Until the FCC guidelines change, there's not much we can do about it at the federal level. And we have had successes at the grassroots level in doing things, but it's interesting that our commission found that we couldn't really do much at the federal level, but we are finding now that at the grassroots level, things seem to be breaking loose. The commission recommendations, ours were somewhat naive in the sense that we were saying, hey, let's go to the federal delegation and ask our congressmen and senators to do something about this. They can't. They don't seem to be willing to, and so that is not the approach to use. And some of these other ones, I think I know I'm limited on time, so I won't go into detail. You can look in our report, but I do want to say that I have gotten involved since my service on the commission with ICBE that was talked about earlier and mentioned a few times in papers. What you've heard about so far and what Dr. Mallory Blythe covered in her presentation were some of these flawed assumptions, so she talked about those. I've talked about some of the other flawed assumptions. And finally, what we have here is some things that we need to address. You mentioned the modulation and impulsation that I don't have time to go into right now, but these are some of the flawed assumptions that need to be addressed, including the one on the lower left, and that involves 5G. We know so little about 5G. Is it more harmful? My own impression and understanding of things is that, yes, it is more harmful for reasons that I can go into in greater detail if people would like to discuss it. But that needs to be addressed because right now, as you pointed out earlier, Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut made the statement, with 5G, we're flying blind. We need to get more information. There are other things that need to be talked about, like how to properly measure the radiation, not measure the typical parameters for that radiation, but its impact on human health. You could take a continuous signal, and it may have less of an impact on a person than an impulsive radiation, but the impulsive radiation would have a lower average power, and that's what's being used right now to indicate the impact on human health. Only wanted to mention a few things is that our recommendations are not dissimilar from those of other groups. And you can read here that our recommendations, the ICBE, we are very similar to those of what's called the EMF Scientists Appeal. Some of you may know about it. Some of you may be involved with it. Also, the 5G Appeal, those overlap with those of the New Hampshire Commission. So we're not really coming up with new things. It's common sense at this point. We've identified a problem. We know it needs to be done. Now we just have to make it happen and figure out ways to make it happen. So there are ways of lowering exposure. We can talk in depth about that. And one thing that the ICB did is they came up with we came up with a paper that describes ways that you can make your cell phone safer to use. I mean, one thing that happens is when you go home at night and you're going to bed, where do you put your cell phone? You probably have a charger right there, and so you put your cell phone down here, and it is continually radiating even though you are not using it. A lot of people don't know that. It has this pretty much not continual, but periodic handshake with the cell tower. Hey, are you there? Yeah, I am, and it sends information back and forth between the phone and the cell tower. So it's radiating while you sleep. And so I would recommend to anybody to turn off your cell phone if you're going to have it on the table next to you or have it close to you at all. But why should you have to do that? Isn't it just common sense? You've put your phone down, it knows it hasn't moved, and the reason for that handshake that I mentioned earlier is for the cell tower to know where the cell phone is. But if you put it down, it knows where it is. It can tell the cell tower before it goes to sleep, hey, here's where I am. If you want to reach me, here's where I am, but I'm going to go to sleep now. And then have it not transmit or receive or transmit at all. Why not? I mean, I'm just naming one thing, but in this paper that I have listed up right here, there are lots of recommendations that could be done at very low cost for the telecommunication or cell phone industry. So advocating things like that. So my final concluding remarks. A formal state commission of unbiased experts formed through bipartisan legislation concluded that low-level wireless radiation, like what you get from your cell phone, is harmful to human health and the environment. Technological developments, again, we could spend a whole day on that easily, should be pursued to lessen your exposure levels. There are lots of things you can do and still enjoy the benefits of using your technology. We love our technology, I do, but we can do it without harming people and ourselves. We should control exposures to wireless radiation as we try to control exposures to chemicals. It's the same type of thing. It is pollution, what is coming out of your phone, what's coming out of a wireless router, or what's coming out of a cell tower. Let's regulate it and do so in a way that makes sense. So my last statement to you is those in a position to do so are strongly encouraged to enact protections against wireless radiation. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
What do you think about the limits in other countries? And they've mentioned Switzerland and Austria. One thing that a lot of people don't realise is how much variation there is in international safety limits. So certain countries have dramatically lower exposure limits, and I mean several orders of magnitude. So China's an example, Russia's an example, certain European groups, Italy, Luxembourg, I think. Switzerland and Austria certainly did have, I can't run through them all. Have you got anything to add to that?
Well, actually, the only thing is, wasn't it Luxembourg, or is it Belgium, that had pretty low standards, but they've been pressured, and I think that they succumbed to that pressure to raise their thresholds again.
So many of them, it's actually very difficult to deploy 5G in the high frequencies under the current limits, particularly the countries with lower ones. So in those countries, there has been a lot of pressured by industrial groups to raise those
Can I just add to that? The Italian one, which is 6 volts per meter, where it's 61 for us and in America. So my radiation meter, it goes off the scale at 6. It only goes up to 6 because that's the limit for Italian safety. And about 4 years ago, as Erica pointed out, industry tried really hard to persuade the Italian parliament to come from 6 up to 61. And a number of us, including the then director of the NIEHS in America, and a lot of heavyweight people like Hardell and lots of people whose names might have been mentioned already, wrote to the Parliament, and it seemed to have played a role in the sense that that was beaten off, that attempt. So in Italy, they still have the 6 volts per meter. I think they're trying to do the same thing in Switzerland now, hoping to get success there. But the attempt by industry to reduce the standards in Italy, and by that you mean raising the limit from 6 to 61, they failed. And that's because people complained and sent letters and mobilized and did the things that both Kent and Erica have said actually change the world. You just get active and stop these people doing what they want to do. So we can do it again, perhaps to help dear old Switzerland with their one.
A question here about, do we know of any studies about EMF causing epilepsy? Personally, I'm aware of quite a few studies showing potentially that non-ionizing radiation can reduce seizure threshold. And there are some animal studies that show that. This says, what can local governments do meanwhile, while they're waiting for central new legislation? What can they do? And I've tried to bring some of these questions together. We've had loads of questions asking what can be done to accommodate people with EHS on a real life level with local government, etc. And the answer is it's really hard, but I have worked with a few local authorities who are trying to accommodate people with EHS, and they're just having to be very creative. And even with government-funded housing, etc., there are solutions that can be found, and councils are trying to do this. So it's a question of using the tools they have in the best way that they can. But this is why I say it is an emergency for us to have designated low EMF zones for residential areas. There's a question here, are there studies on 6G? Considering there are no studies actually really looking at all of the different frequencies used in 5G together as a real life package, then no, I think we're definitely going to be struggling to find anything useful on 6G. There are some Hardell et al. Publications looking at individual case studies where 5G antenna have been deployed and citing symptoms of EHS, but there's very little. This one says, can you name 3 things that we need to overcome the resistance to the science and the need for precaution? It seems like any effort to describe these dangers is dismissed. How do you overcome this? And rather than 3 things, I would just say 1, that we need policymakers, medical professionals and scientists who aren't experts in this field to read the literature. And it sounds very simple, but I do recognise, as somebody who worked in a busy hospital for many years, it's hard to find time to do that outside of your subject of expertise. But that is what needs to happen, is people need to actually read the core literature and the evidence.
And I think going beyond that, you can also bring in the public. That's part of the reason that I'm here and you're here. What I find is that once people realize the risks, hearing some of the outcome of the commission, they get very active. The leaders don't seem to be willing to do what it takes to make the changes that are necessary. But if the people lead, the leaders will follow. And that's what we've seen happen and be successful in a number of locations in the United States, such as Odessa, Florida, and Wyandotte, Michigan. There are many other good examples. So parents see this tower going up on their kid's school, and they find that's the motivation for them finding out about information. And then they hear the information, such as what has been presented today, and they get up in arms and they do something. And so in those 2 locations I mentioned, the cell tower that was supposed to go in is no longer going in. It takes a grassroots movement, is what I've found since being on the commission. Not going to the federal delegation and trying to get them to do something. No, you got to act.
The other thing that causes change, and we'll hear this from Professor Lin in a way, is that when I was dealing with the ionizing radiation field and wanting to reduce the limits by 10-fold, and the International Commission for Radiological Protection, ionizing, said, no, it looks quite safe, I got 4 of the top scientists in the world who, for different reasons, agreed with us. In other words, I just used their wonderful expertise, and they stood out. The father of nuclear medicine, the father of nuclear physics, called Carl Morgan. He came all the way over from the States to talk to my members in the radiation fields to say the existing limits are 5 to 10 times too high. He was joined by Professor Alice Stewart, the first person in the world to show that if you give pregnant women more than 3 X-rays during their pregnancy, it will double the risk of childhood leukemia. She published that in the early 50s. It took 20 years before the doctors would acknowledge that their best tool that they love to give a lot of, X-rays, was damaging children. The third was Ed Radford, chair of a top UN committee who studied iron ore miners in Sweden and found that the alpha radiation was giving them a lot of lung cancer. So those 3 people, giants really, joined the ordinary people, the workers, and people in between like me and others, and they secured a 5-fold reduction in the radiation dose limits in 1990 on that sort of evidence. You shortly will hear from Professor Lin. He's a bit like those 3 I've just mentioned, but he's focusing on non-ionizing radiation. And with people like him behind us, plus the bottom-up stuff that has been described, change will happen. It will happen. It's just a matter of betting on how soon it will happen, but certainly it will. And finally, 2011 was a crucial year. IARC says possible carcinogen. Lloyd's Insurance says we're not insuring this industry. And the Council of Europe, not the European institutions, but the broader one set up after the Second World War, called the Council of Europe, brings in experts, a bit like your New Hampshire thing. They have an inquiry. I go there to represent the European Environment Agency because we've given 3 institutional early warnings, 2007, 2009, and then in evidence to the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe report, you should read it. They say children are more at risk. They say all the things that you're saying, and it was totally ignored. So using that report and that key date of 2011, I think by the time we get to 2024, change will be happening.